The first thing Silas Cobb noticed wasn't the sound of their boots. It was the silence. The crickets stopped. The wind died. Even his old mare, Duchess, who never spooked at anything. Not rattlesnakes, not thunder, not gunfire. Pressed herself flat against the far wall of her stall and refused to breathe. Silas set down the bridle he'd been mending and looked toward the barn doors. 3 women stood in the entrance. Side by side, shoulder to shoulder. The dying light of the evening sun cut around them like a blade, turning their silhouettes into something that didn't look quite human. Something carved. Something deliberate. The tallest one, the one in the middle, tilted her head and smiled. "Evening, Mr. Cobb." She said his name the way a preacher says a dead man's name at a funeral. Like it already belonged to someone gone. Silas didn't reach for his gun. He didn't have one. He'd stopped carrying one 6 months ago, the day he buried it behind the woodshed along with everything it reminded him of. That gun had taken things from him he couldn't get back, and he'd sworn he was done. Now he stood alone in a barn that smelled of hay and horse sweat, facing 3 women he had never seen before, and every instinct in his body told him one thing. They hadn't come to talk. "Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments. Sending love your way wherever you are." Now, Silas Cobb was not a brave man. He was not a hero. He was a 43-year-old horsebreaker living alone on 12 acres of dust in the New Mexico territory. And the most dangerous thing about him was how stubborn he could be when the world told him to run. But the woman in the middle asked him a question that night. A question that still echoes across the mesas, that old-timers still whisper about when the fire burns low. She said, "Think you can survive us all?" And what happened next? Well, that's a story worth telling slow. 6 months before the 3 sisters appeared in his barn, Silas Cobb had done something that most men in the territory considered either courageous or insane. He'd walked away, not from a card game, not from a woman, not from a fight in a saloon where whiskey had made everyone stupid and someone pulled a knife. Those kinds of walking away stories were common, dime a dozen tales of frontier men who chose survival over pride. No, Silas had walked away from a killing, his own. The man's name had been Virgil Dunn. He was a cattle buyer from El Paso with clean fingernails and a laugh that sounded like gravel rolling downhill. He'd cheated Silas out of 19 horses, a deal sealed with forged papers and a lawyer who disappeared the next morning on a train east. 19 horses. Silas had bred them himself, raised them from foals, spent 2 years of his life shaping them into the finest quarter horses in the Southern Territory. They were everything he had. And Virgil Dunn had taken them with a signature and a smile. So Silas had ridden to Las Cruces with his Colt Navy revolver loaded and his mind made up. He'd found Virgil in a rented room above a dry goods store. He'd kicked the door in. He'd pointed the gun at Virgil's chest and watched the man's clean fingernails tremble as he raised his hands. And then something broke. Not in the room. Inside Silas. He saw his father's face. His father, who had died in a pointless gunfight in Abilene when Silas was 11. Died over a disputed fence line. Died in the dirt with blood coming out of his mouth and his eyes looking at a sky he couldn't see anymore. Silas had watched it happen from behind a water trough, too small to help, too scared to scream. He saw that face, his father's dying face, superimposed over Virgil Dunn's terrified one. And he couldn't do it. He lowered the gun. He turned around. He walked out of that room, out of Las Cruces, out of everything he'd been building toward since the day the horses were stolen. He rode home in silence. He dug a hole behind the woodshed. He wrapped the Colt in oilcloth and buried it deep. And he told himself, "I'm done. Whatever I was, I'm done being it." For 6 months, it worked. He lived quietly. He broke horses for ranchers within a day's ride. Gentle work, patient work. The kind that left him too tired at night to think about what he'd lost. He ate alone. He read scripture sometimes, though he didn't believe it. He watched the sunsets from his porch and tried to convince himself that this was peace. But peace in the territory was always borrowed. The evening the sisters came, Silas had been in the barn since late afternoon. Duchess had thrown a shoe, and he'd spent 2 hours filing and fitting a new one, talking to the horse in that low, steady murmur that animals trusted and people found unsettling. The sun was going down orange and purple over the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, that long, waterless stretch of desert that ran south toward the border. He heard no hoofbeats, no wagon wheels, no warning, just the silence, that sudden, total, wrong silence, and then the three shapes standing in his barn door like they'd been placed there by something that wasn't chance. The one on the left was short and broad-shouldered, with red hair cut close to her skull and a sawed-off shotgun resting in the crook of her arm like a sleeping child. The one on the right was thin as a fence post, dark-skinned, dark-eyed, with a coiled bullwhip hanging from her belt and a face that showed absolutely nothing. And the one in the middle, she was tall. Not just tall for a woman, tall the way certain trees are tall, the way certain thunderclouds are tall. She seemed to take up more space than her body accounted for. Her hair was black, her dress was black, and her eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of a sky that's forgotten how to rain. She was the one who spoke. "Silas Cobb," she said, and her voice had a melody to it. A lullaby melody, soft and wrong. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." Silas kept his hands still. He kept his breathing even. He looked at all three of them and calculated his odds and found them to be exactly 0. "I don't know you," he said. The tall woman smiled. "No," she agreed. "But you knew our father." And the temperature in the barn dropped 10 degrees. Their father was Virgil Dunn. Silas felt the name hit him like a mule kick to the sternum. He took half a step back, and the short one with the shotgun noticed. Her eyes tracked the movement the way a cat tracks a bird. "Our father," the tall one continued, stepping forward into the barn, her boots silent on the hay-covered floor, "died 3 weeks ago, shot in the back in a place called Rincon. Someone put 2 bullets between his shoulder blades while he was walking to his horse." She paused. "Let the words settle. The sheriff there, useless man, drinks more than he investigates, said it was likely a robbery. But nothing was taken. His watch was still in his pocket. His money was still in his coat. His horse was still tied to the rail." She stopped 6 feet from Silas, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her pale eyes, the dust on the hem of her black dress, the way her jaw was set like iron. "Someone killed our father for personal reasons, Mr. Cobb. And do you know whose name we found in his papers? Written again and again in letters, in ledger notes, in a journal he kept beneath his mattress." Silas said nothing. "Yours." The barn was quiet except for Duchess shifting nervously in her stall. Somewhere far away, a coyote called out and received no answer. "I didn't kill your father," Silas said. "So you say. I haven't left this property in 4 months. Ask anyone in the valley. Ask Miguel Espinoza, he brings my supplies every 2 weeks. Ask. We don't care about your alibis." The thin one spoke for the first time. Her voice was low, rasping, like something dragged across stone. "Alibis can be bought. Witnesses can be paid. Men lie." The short one with the shotgun shifted her weight. The barrel moved slightly, not pointing at Silas, not pointing away, just existing in that terrible middle space. "My name is Josephine Dunn," the tall one said. "These are my sisters. Clara." She nodded toward the one with the shotgun. "And Pearl," the thin one. "Our father raised us alone after our mother died of cholera in '68. He wasn't a good man, we know that. He cheated people. He lied. He stole. But he was our father, and someone took him from us, and we intend to find out who." She took another step closer. "Your name was all over his papers. He wrote about the horse deal. He wrote about you coming to his room in Las Cruces with a gun. He wrote, and this is the part that interests me, that you swore you would make him pay. That you told him, and I'm quoting now, 'This isn't over, Virgil.' Not by a long road." Silas closed his eyes. He remembered saying those words. He remembered standing in that doorway, gun lowered, shame and rage churning in his gut, and throwing those words over his shoulder like a man tossing a match into dry grass. He hadn't meant them. They were the kind of thing a defeated man says to preserve his last scrap of dignity. But words out here were not just words. Words were evidence. Words were motive. Words were the rope they hung you with. I said those things, Silas admitted. I won't deny it. But saying a thing and doing a thing are different. Are they? Josephine's pale eyes studied him. In my experience, Mr. Cobb, the men who make threats are exactly the men who carry them out. The quiet ones, the ones who say nothing, they're the ones who move on. But you made a promise. And our father ended up dead. I buried my gun, Silas said, and even as he said it, he knew how it sounded. Like an excuse. Like a performance. 6 months ago, I buried it and I swore I was done with violence. I didn't kill Virgil Dunn. I wanted to once, I won't pretend otherwise. But I didn't. Josephine held his gaze for a long, measuring moment. Then she turned to her sisters. Clara, secure the doors. Clara moved without hesitation, swinging the large barn doors shut with a boom that shook dust from the rafters. The last sliver of sunset vanished. The barn plunged into a dim, amber half-light, illuminated only by a single oil lantern hanging from a nail on the center post. "What are you doing?" Silas asked, and for the first time, his voice carried a thread of genuine fear. "We're going to stay here tonight," Josephine said calmly. "The 3 of us. And you. And by morning you're going to tell us the truth, the real truth about what happened to our father. Or we're going to take the answer from you in ways you will not enjoy." Pearl uncoiled the bullwhip from her belt and let it drop to the floor with a sound like a snake hitting packed earth. Silas looked at the 3 of them, at the sealed doors, at the shotgun, at the whip, at those pale blue eyes that held no mercy and no doubt. And he understood something clearly. He was not a guest in his own barn anymore. He was a prisoner. They tied his hands. Not roughly, not yet. Clara did it with a length of rope she'd brought coiled in her saddlebag, looping it around his wrists with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before. The knots were tight, professional. Silas tested them once, discreetly, and felt nothing give. They sat him on an overturned feed bucket near the center post of the barn. The lantern swung gently above him, casting moving shadows that made the walls seem alive. Duchess watched from her stall, her dark eyes wide, her nostrils flaring at the tension she could smell but not understand. Josephine pulled up a hay bale and sat across from him, arranging her black dress around her knees with the calm precision of a woman settling in for a long conversation. Clara positioned herself by the doors, guard duty. Pearl leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, the whip at her feet, watching Silas the way a hawk watches a field mouse deciding which direction to run. "Let's start from the beginning," Josephine said. "I've told you everything. You've told me a version. Versions are not the truth. Versions are what guilty men construct to sound innocent." Silas let out a slow breath. The rope bit into his wrists. The barn smelled of hay and horse and lamp oil and something else. Something that came from the sisters themselves, a scent of trail dust and iron and purpose. "Your father cheated me," Silas said. 19 horses. I bred them, raised them. They were—" He stopped, swallowed. "They were the only thing I had that meant something. My wife had left me 2 years before. I had no children, no family, just the land and the horses. Your father took the horses with fake papers and a paid-off lawyer, and when I went to the law, they told me the documents looked legitimate and there was nothing they could do. So you went to kill him. I went to confront him. I brought the gun because that's what you do out here. You don't walk into a man's room unarmed when he's already proven he'll rob you blind. But you didn't shoot him." "No. Why?" Silas stared at the dirt floor. A beetle was making its way across a crack in the packed earth, slow and deliberate, navigating a world of obstacles no bigger than pebbles. "Because I saw my father," he said quietly. "Not literally. I remembered my father dying. Gunfight in Abilene. I was 11. He died in the street over nothing, over a fence. And I was going to become the same thing. I was going to kill a man over horses, over property, over things that can be replaced. And I couldn't. I lowered the gun and I left." The barn was silent for a long moment. Even the wind outside had stopped. "A touching story," Pearl said from the shadows. and her voice was acid. It's the truth. Then who killed our father? Josephine asked, leaning forward. If not you, who? I don't know. Your father cheated a lot of people. I wasn't the only one. But you were the only one who showed up at his room with a gun. You were the only one who made a threat. That I know of. Josephine studied him. Her pale eyes moved across his face the way a reader moves across a page, searching for meaning, for subtext, for the lie hidden between the lines. Tell me about the day he died, she said. 3 weeks ago. Where were you? Here. On the property. I was breaking a sorrel mare for a rancher named Tom Yates. You can ask him. He was here that morning, dropped the horse off himself. And after he left, I worked the horse all day, ate dinner alone, went to sleep. Can anyone verify that? Silas hesitated, and in that hesitation he saw all 3 sisters register it. A flicker, tiny, almost invisible, but they caught it the way a spider catches a vibration on its web. No, he said. I was alone. Josephine nodded slowly. So you have no witness for the afternoon or evening. The time our father was killed. Rincon is a 2-day ride from here. Even if I'd wanted to, a day and a half if you push hard. We made it in less. Silas felt the trap closing. Not a physical trap, not yet, but a logical one, built with facts and silences and the terrible weight of circumstance. He was the man with the motive, the man with the history, the man who'd pointed a gun at Virgil Dunn's chest and said this isn't over. And he had no alibi for the night Virgil died. I didn't do it, he said again. But the words felt thinner now, worn down by repetition. Josephine stood. She walked to the lantern and adjusted the wick, brightening the flame. The light sharpened. The shadows deepened. Silas's face was fully illuminated now. Every line, every pore, every trace of sweat and fear visible. We're going to find the truth tonight, Mr. Cobb, she said softly. One way or another. She nodded to Pearl. Pearl picked up the whip. Pearl didn't use the whip. Not yet. She held it. Ran her fingers along the braided leather the way a musician handles an instrument before a performance. Testing. Familiarizing. Reminding. She walked a slow circle around Silas, and the sound of her boots on the barn floor was metronomic. Precise. Unhurried. She was in no rush. None of them were. They had all night, and they knew it, and more importantly, Silas knew it. Our father kept a journal, Pearl said, circling. He wrote in it every night. Did you know that? No. He was a compulsive documenter. Every deal, every conversation, every slight. He wrote it all down in a leather-bound book with a brass clasp. We found it after he died, beneath his mattress in the Rincon boarding house. She stopped behind Silas. He could feel her there, the presence of her, like heat from a stove. He wrote about you extensively, Mr. Cobb. Pages and pages. The horse deal, your visit to his room, the look in your eyes when you pointed that gun at him. He wrote, and this stayed with me, he wrote, Cobb had the face of a man saying goodbye to himself. I believe he would have killed me if something hadn't stopped him. I do not know what it was, but I believe he will come back. Men like him always come back. The words landed on Silas like stones dropped from a height. Virgil Dunn, the man he'd tried to forget, the man he'd buried alongside that gun behind the woodshed, had been thinking about him, writing about him, fearing him. And now Virgil was dead, and Silas was tied to a post in his own barn, and 3 women who loved their father were looking for blood. He was wrong, Silas said. I never went back. The journal says otherwise. Silas's head snapped up. What? Pearl came around to face him. Her dark eyes were flat, unreadable, like stones at the bottom of a river. In his final entry, the night before he died, our father wrote, I saw Cobb today. He was in Rincon. He didn't see me, but I saw him. He was standing outside the telegraph office on Main Street, watching the boarding house. My boarding house. He knows where I am. The blood drained from Silas's face. That's not possible. I wasn't in Rincon. I've never been to Rincon in my life. Our father was many things, Josephine said from her hay bale. But he was not prone to hallucination. If he wrote that he saw you, he saw someone he believed to be you. Then he was mistaken. Or he saw someone who looked like me. I was here. You already told us no one can verify your whereabouts that day. That doesn't mean I was in Rincon. His voice echoed off the barn walls. Duchess stamped a hoof. Clara adjusted her grip on the shotgun by the door. Silas forced himself to breathe. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Listen to me, he said, lowering his voice, steadying it. Someone may have killed your father, and someone may have looked like me, but it wasn't me. I have no horse fast enough to make Rincon in a day. You can check my stock. Duchess is the only animal I own, and she's 15 years old with a bad hock. She couldn't make that ride. Josephine's eyes narrowed slightly. The first crack, not in her suspicion but in her certainty. Silas saw it and pressed forward. Your father cheated dozens of people. Horse traders, cattlemen, land buyers. He ran fraudulent deals from El Paso to Santa Fe. I know because after he cheated me I asked around. I wasn't the first, and I guarantee I wasn't the last. Anyone could have followed him to Rincon. Anyone could have. Anyone doesn't have their name written 16 times in a dead man's journal. Pearl cut in, because I was the one who came to his room with a gun. Because I was the one stupid enough to make a threat instead of just walking away quiet. But being stupid and being a murderer are different things. Silence fell again. The lantern flickered. Outside, the wind had returned. A low, moaning sound that pushed against the barn walls like something trying to get in. Josephine looked at Clara. Clara looked at Pearl. A wordless conversation passed between them, the kind only siblings can have, built on years of shared meals and shared losses and shared understanding. Then Josephine said, There's one more thing in the journal. Something I haven't told you yet. She reached into the pocket of her black dress and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly, deliberately, and held it up in the lantern light. It was a sketch, a drawing, done in pencil, rough but recognizable. It showed a man standing in a doorway. The man had a gun in his lowered hand, and his face was drawn with careful attention. The heavy brows, the scarred chin, the deep-set eyes. It was unmistakably Silas Cobb. But there was something else in the drawing. Something Silas hadn't expected. Behind the man, behind the sketch of Silas, there was a second figure, partially hidden, standing in the shadows of the hallway outside Virgil's room. A shape that Silas had never seen, never noticed, never known was there. Someone had been watching that night in Las Cruces. Someone had been standing right behind him when he'd pointed the gun at Virgil Dunn. And Virgil had drawn them both. Who is that? Silas whispered, staring at the shadow figure. Josephine folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. That, she said, is what we're going to find out. The revelation changed the air in the barn the way lightning changes the air before a storm. Something shifted, something rearranged itself, and suddenly the dynamics between the four of them were not what they had been. Silas stared at the pocket where Josephine had replaced the drawing. His mind was racing, retracing that night in Las Cruces. The narrow hallway, the kicked door, the confrontation, the retreat. He'd been so consumed with rage, so tunneled into his own fury and shame, that he hadn't looked behind him. Not once. The hallway had been dark. The boarding house had been quiet. He'd assumed he was alone. But Virgil with his compulsive documenting, his obsessive eyes, had seen someone else, had drawn someone else. Show me the sketch again, Silas said. Why? Because I might recognize them. If someone was following me that night, if someone was watching what happened in that room, I need to see the face. Josephine hesitated. Then she pulled the paper out again and held it in front of him, close enough to see but not close enough to touch. Silas studied the shadow figure. The drawing was rough. Virgil had been no artist, but certain details emerged. The figure was smaller than Silas, slimmer, wearing what looked like a long coat and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low. The face was barely suggested. 2 dark marks for eyes, a line for a mouth. But there was something about the posture, the way the figure stood with weight shifted to one hip, one hand resting at their side. "That's a woman," Silas said. The three sisters went very still. "A woman." Clara spoke from the door, her voice sharp. "Look at the build. The stance. The coat is long, concealing, but the shoulders are narrow. And the way Virgil drew the hand, it's small. Delicate." Josephine pulled the paper back and examined it herself. Her sisters converged. Pearl from the shadows, Clara from the door. And the three of them stood close together, studying their father's drawing with new eyes. Silas watched them. In the lantern light, with their heads bent together over the sketch, they looked less like avenging angels and more like what they actually were. Three daughters trying to understand why their father was dead. Three women carrying grief like a loaded weapon, dangerous not because they were cruel but because they were hurt. "Did your father have enemies who were women?" Silas asked. Josephine looked up. Something had shifted in her pale eyes. Not softness, exactly, but a recalibration. A willingness to consider that the narrative she'd constructed might have a flaw. "Our father had relationships," she said carefully. "After our mother died. Women in various towns. He was not faithful to any of them. He was not kind to most of them." "Any of them in Las Cruces?" The sisters exchanged another wordless look. "There was a woman," Pearl said slowly, "in his journal. He referred to her only by an initial, the letter M. She appeared in entries going back 2 years. He wrote about her differently than the others, more carefully, more cautiously, as if she frightened him." "Frightened him how?" Pearl closed her eyes, recalling. One entry said, "M knows things about me that could destroy everything. I have made a terrible mistake in trusting her. She is not what I believed her to be." The wind howled outside. The lantern swayed. Shadows danced across the faces of the three sisters, and Silas saw the same realization forming in each of them. The slow, dawning understanding that their father's death might not be the simple story they'd wanted it to be. "Did you look for this woman?" Silas asked. "Before you came for me?" Josephine's jaw tightened. "We went to the sheriff first. He was useless. Then we found the journal, and your name was everywhere. And she stopped. "We needed someone to be responsible. You were the clearest candidate. So you came here to make me confess to something I didn't do. We came here to find the truth." "No. You came here to confirm what you'd already decided. There's a difference." The words hung in the air. Josephine didn't deny them. A long silence followed. Silas felt the rope on his wrists, felt the ache in his shoulders from sitting hunched on the feed bucket, felt the accumulated weight of the night pressing down on him. But something else was happening too. Something he hadn't expected. The conversation was shifting from interrogation to investigation, from accusation to collaboration. "Untie me," he said. "No, I'm not your enemy. I'm the one person who was in that room and walked away. If someone else was there that night, if someone followed me, watched what happened, and then spent the next 6 months tracking your father, then you need me. You need what I saw, what I remember, what I might have noticed without knowing it." Josephine studied him for a long time. The barn creaked in the wind. Duchess let out a low, nervous whinny. Then Josephine knelt in front of Silas, brought her face close to his, and said quietly, "If you run, Clara will shoot you in the spine. If you reach for any kind of weapon, Pearl will take your hand off at the wrist. These are not threats. These are facts. Do you understand?" "I understand." She reached behind him and cut the ropes. Silas rubbed his wrists, wincing as blood flowed back into his fingers. He stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his back, and for a moment the four of them stood in the lantern light in a loose circle. No longer captor and prisoner, but something stranger. For people in a barn in the middle of nowhere trying to solve a murder. "The woman," Silas said. We need to find out who she is." "How?" "Your father's journal. Does he describe her? Where she lived? What she looked like? Anything?" Pearl pulled the journal from her saddlebag. A worn leather book, stained with trail dust and something darker. She opened it to a page near the back and read aloud. Em came to me again last night. She knows about the Cobb horses. She knows about the Alderman land deal. She knows about Prescott. She says she will remain silent if I do what she asks. But what she asks grows heavier each time. I am beginning to believe that Em does not want money. She wants something else entirely. Something I cannot give. She wants me to suffer. The last words seemed to echo in the barn, bouncing off the walls, settling into the hay, sinking into the ground. Suffer. He was being blackmailed, Silas said. By someone who wanted more than money, Josephine agreed. By someone who wanted revenge. The four of them looked at each other. And for the first time that night, they were all thinking the same thing. Whoever Em was, she had done what Silas couldn't. She had killed Virgil Dunn. It was Clara who figured it out. Clara, the shortest, the quietest, the one with the shotgun who had spoken the least all night. She had been sitting by the barn door, listening to everything, saying almost nothing, and somewhere in the silence of her listening, something had connected. Marisol, she said. Everyone turned to her. Marisol Reyes. Papa mentioned her once. Years ago. He said she was the smartest woman he'd ever met, and the most dangerous. He said it like it was a joke. He was drunk. I was 14. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Who is she? Silas asked. I don't know. He never mentioned her again. But the way he said her name, it wasn't the way he talked about his other women. It was different. It was... Clara searched for the word. Afraid. Pearl rifled through the journal, scanning pages, her dark eyes moving rapidly. She stopped at an entry dated 8 months before Virgil's death. Marisol came to Mesilla last week. She showed me a document she claims proves the Alderman land deal was fraudulent. She is correct. It was. She says if I do not make restitution to the families I displaced, she will take the document to the territorial judge. I told her I would think about it. She said I had until the new moon. She said, think carefully, Virgil. I am not the forgiving kind. Restitution, Josephine murmured. She wanted him to give back what he'd stolen. And when he didn't, Silas said, they all understood. Josephine paced the length of the barn. Her black dress whispered against the hay-strewn floor. Her mind was working. Silas could see it in her eyes, in the way she moved, in the tension of her hands. She followed him, Josephine said, reconstructing. Town to town, deal to deal. She gathered evidence of every fraud, every theft, every lie. She tried to make him do the right thing. And when he refused, she was there the night I confronted him, Silas added. In Las Cruces, she saw me raise the gun. She saw me lower it. She saw me walk away. And she realized that if she killed him, you would be the perfect suspect. The man who'd already pointed a gun at him. The man who'd made a threat. The pieces were falling into place with the terrible precision of a clockwork mechanism. Each gear turning the next. Each revelation leading inevitably to the one that followed. But who is she? Silas asked. What did your father do to her specifically? Blackmail only works if there's a personal motive. What did Virgil Dunn take from Marisol Reyes? The barn fell silent. The sisters looked at each other. Pearl turned to the earliest entries in the journal, the ones from 2 years ago when Em first appeared. She found it on the 3rd page. A woman came to see me today about the Alderman property. She says her family, the Reyes family, held the original land grant from the Mexican government, and that the documents I used to claim the land were forged. She is, I fear, correct. Her family had a homestead on that property for 30 years before I arrived. I arranged for their displacement through the territorial court. What happened to them afterward is not my concern. But this woman, she looks at me as though it is. Pearl turned the page. I have learned more about the Reyes family. After they were removed from the Alderman property, they attempted to settle on unclaimed land near Rincon. The father, Esteban Reyes, died of exposure that first winter. The mother followed shortly after. There were 4 children. 3 survived. The eldest is the woman who came to see me, Marisol. The words settled over the barn like a funeral shroud. Virgil Dunn had stolen Marisol Reyes's family land. Her parents had died as a result. She had spent years gathering evidence, trying to force him to make it right. And when he wouldn't, when he continued to cheat and steal and smile his gravel-rolling smile, she had ended him. Silas looked at the three sisters. He saw something terrible happening behind their eyes, the collision of love and truth, of loyalty and justice, of the father they'd mourned and the man he'd actually been. "Our father killed her parents," Josephine said quietly. Not a question. A statement. A reckoning. "Not directly," Pearl said, but her voice was thin, unconvinced by her own defense. "He took their land. He took their livelihood. He sent them into the desert with nothing. They died." Josephine's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. "That is not directly. That is murder by paperwork. Murder by indifference." Clara set the shotgun down on the floor. The sound it made was small, but in the silence of the barn, it was enormous. Final. "So what do we do?" Clara asked. The question sat in the center of all of them like an object on a table. Solid, heavy, impossible to ignore. Silas watched the three sisters and said nothing. This was not his decision. This was theirs. Their father. Their grief. Their justice or their vengeance, whichever they chose. Josephine stood motionless for a long time. The lantern burned. The wind blew. The desert outside stretched in every direction. Vast, indifferent, keeping its own counsel. Finally, she spoke. "We came here to find our father's killer." "We did," Pearl said. "And we found something else instead." She walked to where Clara had set down the shotgun. She picked it up. Silas tensed. Every muscle in his body went rigid. But Josephine simply carried it to the barn wall and leaned it in the corner, barrel pointed at the ceiling, away from everyone. "We found the truth," Josephine said. "And the truth is that our father was not the victim. He was the cause." She turned to Silas. "Mr. Cobb, I owe you an apology. You owe me more than that. You owe me a new length of rope and 6 hours of my life back." The faintest ghost of a smile crossed Josephine's face. It vanished immediately, but Silas had seen it. Human, tired, real. "We'll be leaving at first light," she said. "We won't trouble you again." "What about Marisol?" Josephine was quiet for a long moment. "Marisol Reyes lost her parents because of our father. She tried to make him fix it. He refused. I'm not saying what she did was right, but I understand why she did it. And I will not be the one to bring her to a hangman's rope for avenging a crime that the law refused to punish." She looked at her sisters. One by one they nodded. "Some justice," Josephine said, "doesn't come from a courtroom." They left at dawn. The three sisters rode out of Silas Cobb's property in single file. Josephine first, then Clara, then Pearl. Their horses moving slow and steady across the flat, sun-baked earth toward the eastern horizon. They didn't look back. They didn't wave. They simply rode, three dark shapes against the brightening sky, carrying a truth that would reshape everything they understood about the father they'd loved and buried. Silas watched them from his porch, a cup of black coffee in his hand. Duchess standing beside him with her nose pressed against his shoulder. The morning was cold. The desert was gold. The world was exactly as it had been 24 hours earlier, and it was nothing like it had been at all. He thought about Virgil Dunn, the gravel laugh, the clean fingernails, the 19 horses that had vanished into someone else's name. He thought about a woman named Marisol Reyes who had lost everything and spent years building a case for justice that no court would ever hear. He thought about 3 daughters who had ridden across the territory to avenge a man who might not have deserved avenging. And he thought about himself, the gun buried behind the woodshed, the night he'd almost become a killer, the shadow in the hallway he never saw. He'd been so close to pulling that trigger, so close to becoming another name in a dead man's journal, another life consumed by the machinery of violence and retribution that ground through this territory like millstones. But something had stopped him, his father's face, a memory, a ghost. And because he'd stopped, because he'd lowered the gun and walked away, he was still here, still breathing, still standing on his own porch, watching the sun come up over land that was harsh and beautiful and utterly indifferent to the small, brutal dramas that played out across its surface. He finished his coffee. He set the cup on the railing. He walked around the back of the house to the woodshed, knelt in the dirt, and looked at the spot where the Colt Navy was buried. He left it there. Some things belong in the ground. The sun climbed higher. The heat came. The desert stretched out in every direction. Patient, endless, keeping its secrets the way it always had. And Silas Cobb went back to work. What would you have done in his place? Would you have buried the gun? Or dug it up? Let me know in the comments. And if the story stayed with you, you know what to do. The desert remembers everything, even the things we try to forget.